that to help ensure that the catalyst will perform its duty. The catalyst is the last line of defense for controlling emissions of air toxics and criteria pollutants. So if the catalyst fails, and that goes undetected for a period of time, there's possibly a likelihood of an exceedance of numerous air quality standards. In my practice, I've been involved with some catalysts, and it's, in my view, based on what I've observed, I feel there's a very common sense, Yankee ingenuity scale things that could be added to the permit that wouldn't be burdensome to the facility, in my opinion.
Okay. And so are you offering the opinion that the air pollution regulations require strict compliance with the AALs and TELs?
Yes.
Okay. And that those are in fact hard limits that you cannot model potential emissions over and still be eligible for a plan approval application, in your view, correct?
I can tell you a few things. I had a similar experience to what we're talking about today, where we had an exceedance of the formaldehyde standard in another state. It was one receptor in a field in a very remote area. And what we ultimately did was went back to the drawing board and remodeled to demonstrate compliance. That's the first thing I'll mention. The second thing I'd like to mention is it's my understanding that the applicant adopted the Massachusetts Air Toxics Guidelines as the standard for this project. It's the standard against which it's being compared to, evaluated against. The modeling results were presented in relation to the AALs and TELs. So it would seem to me that those are the standards that were adopted by the applicant for this project. So it would be in the interest of, I'm sure the applicant wants to do a study that's protective of public health and conservative and so on and so forth, and do really good work. And so I'm assuming that would be the standard that was adopted and adhered to and would continue to be adhered to as a matter of doing best possible work that can be done to protect the public health.
That's an assumption you're making.
That is.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's the way. I hope this doesn't sound self-righteous, but that would be what I would want to follow in my practice if I were presented this situation.
Okay, and in your experience, the AALs and TELs in Massachusetts are understood to be strict limits and not screening values. Is that correct?
I would adopt them as strict limits in my work. That's what I would do. I have, in my project work that I know is coming down the pike, we'll be doing modeling and we will evaluate the results against the TELs and AALs, and if we don't comply, then we'll have to go back to the drawing board and figure out how we can.
But in your experience with respect to other projects in Massachusetts, have you seen the Mass DEP apply the AALs and TELs as strict limits and not screening values?
I can't say that I have or that I have not. I can say that in the practice in the firm where I am now, that our view and the way we do our work is to permit projects to meet the AALs and TELs. To not do that would be to take on a level of risk for the client that would put them at risk in a sense. So adhering to those limits or ways of are entirely achievable in my view. I don't see reason. I've never been in a situation where in any state where we haven't been able to meet air toxic standards, but I've never been in a situation where we've ignored them. And I don't mean to say that the applicant is ignoring the standard, because I'm sure the applicant wants to do good work and do the right thing. But they carry a lot of weight.
With respect to the example that you cited in another state where you showed an exceedance of formaldehyde, you testified a minute ago that you went back and you were able to demonstrate compliance, correct?
Correct.
Was that just simply by changing the model?
We changed aspects of the facility design, which were then reflected in the model. So we had a conversation with the client. We informed them that we were over the formaldehyde limit, and we discussed ways to change the project design and proposed operation so that we could meet the limit.
And what state was that in?
Vermont.
And the mass regulations don't apply in Vermont, right?
They do not.
You performed, in paragraph 21 I'm referring to, you say that you performed a peer review of the applicant's plan approval application, is that correct?
Yes.
And in your testimony, you've identified what you see as the significant issues with respect to the application and the applicant's modeling in your testimony, correct?
Right. The only, if you want to call, I'm not sure if we want to call it an issue or not, but when I finished my peer review, one of the things that I observed was that startups and shutdowns were not modeled and could have been modeled. So my focus was on that.
And did you identify any other significant issues with respect to the applicant's modeling?
No, I did not.
And what about with respect to the applicant's plan approval application?
The plan approval application provided me the information I needed to model startups and shutdowns. So I didn't identify anything that, any significant errors or anything that needed, in my view, to be corrected. There's some math that didn't quite line up was with respect to formaldehyde startup emissions. The annual emissions from 416 9-minute startups, I recall, were, I don't know why I'm remembering this, but 0.3669 tons per year, 735 pounds per year. And I don't think that corresponds to the 1.76 pounds per hour. That's also, there's a couple different ways to do the math. I don't think it has a material difference, and it's not going to, the route you take in determining the pound per hour emission rate isn't going to change the conclusions of the work that I did or that Mr. Fickus did. But that was the only thing that I noticed, and it's, those are my thoughts on that.
Okay. And putting that aside, you do say that you peer reviewed the applicant's plan approval application, so I just want to make sure there are no other issues with respect to the application that you've identified, correct?
That is correct.
In paragraph 7 of your testimony, you indicate that you have expertise in air quality monitoring and emissions estimation. Is that correct?
Let me catch up with you. Paragraph 7.
Yes.
I wrote areas of expertise in air quality modeling, emission estimation, air permit application preparation, and pollution control technology evaluations. Did you say that I wrote that I have expertise in air monitoring? Because I didn't put that in there.
Oh, air quality modeling,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
And emissions estimation though?
Yes.
Those are, okay. Can you tell me what sort of training and experience one needs to have expertise in air quality modeling and emissions estimation?
Sure. There are a number of ways to develop the knowledge and skills that are needed to be able to perform an emission estimate and air dispersion modeling. I can tell you the route that I took. My route began about 20 years ago, where I began mentoring under a senior staff person who began to teach me how to do emission estimates in his line of work. I became interested in the area of air permitting and modeling, so I began preparing air emission statements. These are the annual air emission statements that facilities have to submit in various states annually, and that work's peer reviewed by states. After that, began to help my supervisor develop air quality models. He would prepare the emission estimates, and we would work together on parameterizing the model, just to get me familiar with how to parameterize and run a model. Somewhere about 19 or 20 years ago, I decided to get some more formal training. One of the first things I did, ironically, was to attend a training course, a 2-day training course by Trinity Consultants outside of Philadelphia, where I think Richard Schultz taught the course. And so it was a modeling theory course where we looked at the various aspects of modeling: meteorology, terrain, types of facilities, types of models. We did some sample exercises. I did that. And then not too long after that, I took my first air modeling course with a company called Beeline Software. They make modeling software similar, they're a competitor to Trinity. They make a GUI interface that runs the AirMod model. And I attended a 2-day training course in Asheville, North Carolina. So those 2 courses I took approximately between 18 and 20 years ago. Was still very interested in doing air permitting and modeling. So I began to do more modeling work from the firm I used to work for, which is called RSG. Began preparing permit applications. And a little further down the line, became interested in getting a certification similar to a professional engineer's license. I obtained what's called Qualified Environmental Professional Certification, QEP. So I had to study for the QEP. It took roughly a few years to gear up for that. That was right before, somewhere around the early 2000s, right before my twins were born, and I knew I had to get it done before the double dose arrived. So I spent a few years taking correspondence courses through the US EPA Air Pollution Training Institute, APTI, which is run out of NC State, or was at the time. Took probably about 5 or 6 of those courses, passed them all. All the while still doing air permitting and modeling, my firm RSG. I obtained my QEP certification, and in conjunction with that, I joined the Air and Waste Management Association, AWMA, and began to attend their national conference and other regional conferences. Presented a few times. Presented at AWMA about a year ago, actually. So I've been involved with AWMA over the years, and over the years I've done a few refresher courses in air modeling provided by what was Beeline Software, and which is now called Providence Oris Solutions. So just this past October, I organized an opportunity for my firm, for myself and our staff, to do a 4-day modeling course. We flew up a person from Providence Oris to come to our Littleton, Mass office and to work with us over 4 days. So, probably leaving some things out.
No, okay. I think we're getting the point. Is it fair to say that in order to be an expert with respect to air quality modeling, and emissions estimation, that you need specialized training?
Yes.
And you need substantial experience in applying the tools that you learned through that training, correct?
Yes, and it depends on the model you want to use. There are some more simpler models to run that such as the screen model. But for someone who wants to run air mod, you need specialized training and experience.
You mentioned the QEP designation. What is that?
It stands for Qualified Environmental Professional, and it is sponsored by the Institute for Professional Environmental Practice. And in order to become certified QEP, you have to have a certain number of years of experience in the air pollution field, and you have to take an exam and pass it. And then there are recertification requirements where after you pass the test, there are things you need to do to make sure that you don't forget what you learned. So, yeah.
Is one of the things that you need to do is agree by the Institute of Professional Environmental Practices Code of Ethics?
Yes.
And is that code relevant to the work that you did in this case?
It's relevant to all that I do.
What in a general sense is the Code of Ethics?
I don't have it in front of me. I couldn't tell you, but I can take a rough, roughly describe
I won't
it.
hold you to the letter of that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. One of the aspects of the Code of Ethics is not to consult in areas where you aren't qualified to consult. So, for example, it wouldn't be ethical for me to review the stormwater, wastewater aspects of this project. That's what I remember, and I think that's what that's been etched in my brain, and it's been a good guiding principle over the years.
You should not offer opinions and things that you are not qualified to offer.
You shouldn't get involved in projects that you don't have the expertise to. That would be helpful.
In paragraph 10 of your testimony, you testify that in your career you have evaluated emissions from combustion turbines, correct?
Yes.
What do you mean exactly?
I've worked on a few projects that involve turbines. One project involved turbines at the SUNY ESF in Syracuse. That's a university right next to Syracuse. And what I did was I did permitting and modeling for a combined heat and power plant. And one of the fuel burning sources was a set of microturbines burning gas. That's one project I worked on. Another project I worked on.
Can I pause you there for one
Sure.
second? Did you model emissions from combustion from those turbines?
Yes. So we took the, we estimated the emission rates, the stack parameters, exhaust flow rate, exhaust temperature, all that other stuff. Another project I worked on was regarding the Indian Point nuclear power plant. I was hired I worked under an organization called Riverkeeper, where we evaluated the feasibility for cooling towers to be built and permitted and meet air quality standards. And part of the project was what would happen if the power plant was taken offline. In those conditions, a lot of the power that would go to New York City would be shut off. And in that case, the power plants or mini power, whatever you want to call them, the power generating facilities in the New York City area would have to turn on, theoretically. And we evaluated, okay, well, if that situation occurred, would it be possible for that to meet Clean Air Act requirements? And so this was back in 2013, so I'm not going to recall every detail accurately. But we did look at facilities, peaker units that were permitted that had turbines and their emission limits, their permit requirements. There's a couple of, I've done some peer reviews of some other proposed power plants that involve turbines, but I just don't remember the name right now.
And you did modeling with respect to each of the projects that we've just talked about, correct?
I did modeling for the SUNY ESF project. I did modeling for the Indian Point project, but what I modeled were the proposed cooling towers.
not combustion turbines.
Right, not for the Indian Point project.
And with respect to the SUNY project, did you model startup sequence for the turbine there?
I did not, because the proposed operation was a continuous one where the turbines would operate all the time.
They were never shut down?
Maybe shut down for maintenance, as any pollution source would, but it wouldn't start up and shut down at a regular frequency that would be predictable or unpredictable.
They didn't require regular maintenance?
I wasn't involved with evaluating the maintenance requirements for them. What I was asked to do was to model them operating at their permitted level.
Okay, but in any case, you didn't model startup or shutdown emissions with respect to that project, correct?
I did not.
And have you modeled before your work in this case emissions associated with startup or shutdown sequences for combustion turbines?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, before you work in this case,
Yep.
have you ever done modeling of startup or shutdown sequences for combustion turbines?
I have not.
You did do them in this case, correct?
I did.
And you didn't actually do your own modeling of the emissions associated with the regular operation of the turbine that's proposed for the compressor station, correct?
I didn't create a model from scratch.
Right.
I wouldn't have been able to do that just because I didn't have the information to do that. It would have been possible with the information that was available, not available to me.
And so what you did is expand upon the modeling that the applicant prepared, correct?
That's correct.
And this is in reference to 35 about your testimony. You expanded the applicant's model by importing the applicant's modeling files into your own interface, correct?
Correct.
And I think that's something you mentioned a minute or two ago as the GUI.
That's right.
And
That's right.
Is that called Beast?
Yes. Believe it or not, it's called a beast.
Um,
It's really not a beast to run. I probably use a different name, but it is what it is.
And so once you imported the applicant's modeling files into your modeling interface, which is called Beast, you then ran model runs using the applicant's files, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we wanted to make sure, first of all, that we imported the files correctly. They were generated, I assume, in Trinity's Breeze software. So what we did was we imported 2 sets of files. We ran them, and then we compared the results that we obtained by running them with the results provided in the modeling report, and the numbers were all very close. Maybe it differed by as much as like 1/10 of a decimal, but for all intents and purposes, they were very comparable.
And in that process, you didn't identify any problems with the applicant's modeling, correct?
I did not.
And the next step in your process was to reconfigure the model to include what you say are startup conditions and then model for formaldehyde. Is that correct?
Correct.
With respect to paragraph 36, you say that the applicant performed modeling runs for each year in a 5-year period, correct?
Correct.
Do you understand why they did that?
Yes. The point of doing that is to identify a worst case year. The worst case year would be the year in which the highest model predicted concentration occurs.
And that's something that a modeler would typically do, correct?
In this case, yes, when you're in the state of Massachusetts, with the way they require one to do modeling, that's what you would do.
The state wants you to look at the worst case scenario, yes?
Yes.
But you didn't actually look at all 5 years, you just looked at the year that resulted in the highest concentrations for formaldehyde, correct?
Yes, because that is the way the process works. We did look at the other years in as much as we observed the model predicted concentrations, and then we ranked them and determined that 2013 was the year in which the highest concentration occurred.
And all
And
the, sorry, go
And
ahead.
I believe Mr. Fickus concurred with that in his rebuttal testimony.
I believe so too.
Yeah.
So then what you aim to do is compare the modeled results to the AALs and TELs in the worst case year to see if the model predicts exceedances.
Correct.
And what is an AAL?
Allowable ambient limit.
What does that mean?
That is the maximum allowable concentration.
And what do you base your definition of AAL on?
Can you rephrase the question? I'm not sure I understand.
Yes, you just provided a definition of allowable ambient limit, correct?
Correct.
And where did you get that definition from?
Well, first of all, it's in the name itself, allowable ambient limit. So that would imply that a concentration above the limit would not be allowable. There is the Massachusetts guidelines for air toxics that I did review. I didn't review every nook and cranny of it, but I'm aware of that document and have gone through it and couldn't recite the chapter and verse of every part of it.
And what is a TEL?
Threshold emission limit.
And what does that mean?
Similar to an AAL, it's a limit that your model predicted result needs to be less than. That's what that means to me.
And where did you get that understanding from?
Same as for the AAL.
What does the word threshold mean in the term threshold emission limit?
I'm not a toxicologist, so that's more for what a toxicologist would answer. But in my work, it's the limit. So it's kind of a black or, my view is it's kind of a black or white thing. You either meet the limit or you don't meet the limit.
With respect to paragraph 37, you testified that to model startup sequences, you developed 4 different models, each one assuming that a startup sequence would start at a specific time every day of the year, correct?
Yeah, what I did, so I became aware that there are, at least the application lists 416 startups per year. That's about 1 per day, 1.12 or 3 or whatever per day. So it's roughly 1 per day. So it's based on the information that I evaluated, likely that there would be about 1 startup per day. So I decided that I wanted to understand how the impacts would vary according to the time of day in which a startup would occur. So I looked at 4 different times within a 24-hour period that are equally divided. So midnight, 6 a.m., high noon, 6 p.m. I didn't model every hour of the day because I felt that that would be more than is necessary to develop the understanding that I was pursuing. And so the results are pretty similar for each of those hours. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And with respect to the 4 different models you ran, for each one, you used a single fixed time, assuming that the turbine started up at that time, correct?
Yes, so I did that because I wanted to understand how that scenario would play out in the modeling results. how much, if we assumed that there's roughly one startup per day, and the model predicts roughly the same impacts at any hour of the day, then the question is, well, how much, in that approach, how much do we affect, how much is the 24-hour concentration that the model predicts affected, and how much is the annual concentration that the model predicts affected? In this scenario, it's kind of like one dose of air toxics going into the air 1 hour of the day. Important to do that because, as you know, as we know, hopefully most of us know that the startup emissions are significantly higher than normal operation. So it's a big slug of air pollution that goes into the air, roughly speaking, in 1 hour. Startup emissions, I want to say, are about over 400 times higher than normal operation. So I felt that it was important to really focus on that 1 hour, given that.
And you don't expect the turbine to start up at the same time every day of the year, correct?
Based on what I've evaluated, it appears that it would run approximately once per day. The time of day when it runs isn't so important. I mean, it is important. All aspects of the project are important. But as I said, when I modeled the 4 times a day, we achieved roughly the same result. So the point of that is that if the applicant in this case were to select an hour and model that and submit that to the DEP for review, I think that would be sufficient for evaluating a conservative approach for evaluating the 24-hour annual impacts.
But the scenarios that you're modeling are proxies, and they do not model scenarios that you actually expect to occur with those 4 models, correct?
I expect startups to occur. Again, based on the information I evaluated, it appears that startups occur roughly on a daily basis.
But not at the same time every day, correct?
Correct. That's why I modeled 4 different times a day.
But each of those models assumes that the machine starts up at the same time every day for the entire year, correct?
Not really. I mean, it's yes and no. So let me explain the yes and let me explain the no. So if you and I were to sit side by side, and I were to show you the model, and you were to look at it, if the model is parameterized to turn a startup on at the same time of the day for every day of the year. That's the way we modeled it. But we modeled 4 different times of day to kind of develop an understanding of what it would be like if it were to cut on any time of the day. So I think we made an effort, I made an effort to conceptualize, to understand what the impacts would be if the compressor were to cut on at any time of the day.
So you're learning something through this process, but with respect to each of the 4 models that you ran, none of them model a scenario that you expect to actually happen. You don't expect the turbine to start up at the same time every day, correct?
Models are approximations of what will happen in the real world. So the model was developed to reflect my best understanding of what would happen.
Right. But each of the specific scenarios that you model
Yep.
to learn information from,
Yeah.
model a scenario that you do not actually expect to occur in the real world, correct?
Well, I think that I see your point. I acknowledge your point, but I think that that's not necessarily relevant to what the model tells us. What the model tells us is that if the compressor station were to operate at any hour of the day, I mean, we modeled enough hours of the day to give me confidence that we've kind of covered the whole time of day so if the compressor cut on at 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m., whatever hour within a 24-hour period, the modeling gives me confidence that, well, it does reflect a startup at a single time of day, day after day after day, we've covered the territory. We've modeled all the hours of the day, the year. And, so it helps us understand, it would, I would say, cover, for lack of a better way to describe it, what the impacts would be whenever the compressor would run.
You certainly didn't model every hour of the day, though, correct? You used 4 hours to get an idea of what the day looked like.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so it, I didn't see a need to model more. That isn't to say that if this were required by Mass DEP, that the applicant would need to expand and look at more hours of the day. Maybe if Mass DEP, I'm not Mass DEP, but if they were to review it, they might sign off on just modeling 4 hours, 4 different hours of the day.
The AirMod model is based on a 1 hour time step, correct?
Yep.
What does
Yes. So what that means is it marches forward in its calculations at a 1 hour time step.
And in that sense, the AirMod model is not designed to model events that last for less than an hour, correct?
I don't know if I would agree with that.
Can you use AirMod to model a 9-minute event?
Yes,
And you have to parameterize the model to include the remaining 51 minutes in any given hour to model a 9-minute event, correct?
that's correct. So I did that, Mr. Fickus did that.
But you can't just use AirMod to model a 9-minute event. You have to look at the entire hour in which that event occurs.
That's right. And AirMod is the best available tool that we have. If there was a better tool, then if there is one, please tell me. We should take a look at it.
So when you're modeling startup sequences and you're looking at the hour in which startup emissions occur, you do that by assuming a startup sequence, a 9-minute startup sequence,
Yes.
and then followed by 51 minutes of normal operation of the turbine, correct?
Yes.
And then the other 23 hours of the day that goes into your model would also be normal operation of the turbine, correct?
That's right.
And you explained that you did this, and I'm looking at paragraph 39 of your testimony in subsection D. You did this to prevent the emissions model from double counting the normal emissions reflected in the weighted average values that you used, correct?
That's right. So the source in the model, we turned off. The source that represents normal operation, we turned it off using the hour of day function. So you can plug in a 0 or 1 for every hour of the day. And that's the number that actually gets multiplied by the emission rate. So if you plug in a value of 0, you're multiplying 0 times the emission rate from the normal operation source. So it's effectively, turned off, switched off in the model. And then by the same token, we use the hour of day feature to turn on the compressor station. So it has all zeros and then 1 and then all zeros to represent how we would turn it on and off in a 24-hour period.
And so in a practical sense, what you're modeling is days represented by 23 hours and 51 minutes of operation and 9 minutes of startup.
Correct.
And those days span out across a year.
Yes.
Every day, 9 minutes of startup, 23 hours and 51 minutes of normal operation, correct?
Yes.
And one of the reasons that you don't want to include double counting in the model is that you don't want to model emissions that are not expected to be generated, correct?
That's correct.
And you don't want to model emissions that are not expected to be generated because that would artificially inflate model emissions, correct?
That's right. So, well, the point here is we were focused on the turbine, and so I wanted to make sure we didn't double count the turbine. And we modeled all other emission sources because for air permit modeling, your permit mirrors what you modeled. So you have to model all your emission sources operating at the proposed limits simultaneously. If you don't do that, then typically have to accept a permit restriction that would say, if the applicant had used the same method I did to turn off, and the applicant didn't, but the applicant had turned off any of the other emission sources for whatever reason to minimize the model's predicted concentration, then that would have to ultimately be turned into a permit condition, limiting those specific emission sources.
If you've modeled the turbine starting up once a day, every day of the year,
Yes,
and that's what you've done, correct?
yes,
It also has to be off once a day, every day of the year, correct?
yes,
And when the turbine is off, it doesn't cause combustion emissions, correct?
well, that is correct, but going back to what I just mentioned earlier, the way the process works in this case is that for permit modeling, you wouldn't turn the compressor off, because if you did, then you would wind up with a permit restriction. Do you follow?
I do know what you're saying,
Okay.
but I'm curious if your startup modeling accounted for the notion that in order for the turbine to actually start up every day of the year, as you modeled,
Right.
it actually has to be off every day of the year as well.
So I agree with that. But again, the reason I didn't configure the model with the turbine turned off was because I was following the way permit modeling works, in which the applicant did. And the applicant didn't turn the turbine off, the applicant kept it on in the model. So as to assume, create a, to avoid a permit restriction on when it can operate. So yes, I agree with you that it has to be off in order for it to turn on
Every day.
every day. However, in the permitting process, you can't reflect that in the model unless you want to accept a permit restriction. And I, in reviewing the work, didn't observe that the facility requested one. The only restriction that was requested, I think, was to limit startups to 30 minutes. But beyond that, I'm not aware of any other requests for like a fuel burn limit or an hour of operation limit or anything like that.
If the permit contemplates 416 startup events per year,
Yeah.
you said, then the permit also contemplates 416 shutdown events per year, correct?
It does, and so if it does, then shutdowns should probably be modeled too.
Okay. And after the machine is shut down, it's off and it does not emit combustion emissions, correct?
That's correct.
And that is not accounted for in your modeling, correct?
It couldn't be accounted for because my the way my approach to doing this work was to do what the applicant would have done. And if I were hired to do this work, what I would have done is kept the model the way it is. I wouldn't have, unless my client was interested in taking a permit restriction, then I would model everything running all the time and then add in the startup and shutdowns too as well.
But the DEP did not require the applicant to model startup emissions in the first instance, correct?
No, they did not.
And what I'm actually trying to understand is I'm trying to understand how closely your modeling relates to what we actually expect to happen as a result of this facility.
Sure.
And one of the differences between your modeling and what we actually expect is that your modeling doesn't include the periods of time when the machine is shut down, which is a necessary condition of the events that you're modeling, correct?
In practice, it has to shut down for maintenance.
Right. And in order to start up.
And in order to start up, right? But the intent is for it to run a considerable number of hours per year, presumably.
But you are modeling startup events happening every day, correct?
Yes.
Which means that every day there is also a period of time when the turbine is not emitting combustion emissions, correct?
I can't, yes, that has to happen. I mean, that's physics. It has to happen, but again,
And your model does not account for that, correct?
The modeling that I did was the way modeling is done.
Yes.
That I followed the standard procedure for the way modeling is done.
And it doesn't account for the period of time when the turbine is not emitting combustion emissions every day, correct?
So if the applicant wants to take the modeling that I did, or that they've developed thus far, and they want to take credit for the time that the turbine is not operating, then they'll have to do the math to show that, and they'll have to likely accept a permit restriction.
But your model hasn't done that, correct?
It hasn't done that, but for the reason that I was trying to be as consistent as possible with what the applicant.
But the applicant didn't model startup emissions, correct?
No. They modeled the turbine running year-round, which I don't think will happen as well.
So
It won't run year-round either.
do we agree?
So I guess I'm just trying to make the point that you said, you're asking why I didn't model the turbine being shut off, and the applicant didn't model the turbine being shut off.
That wasn't actually my question.
Okay, well, whether or not it was a question, I just would like to offer that clarification. Sorry, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but.
I will try not to cut you off if you try to answer my questions, specific questions I'm asking, okay?
Fair enough, deal.
Do we agree that in the sense that your model did not include the period of time that the turbine is not emitting combustion emissions every day, that in that sense, at the very least, your model is conservative?
Yes.
We'd agree on one point.
The flip side of that would, of course, be that we didn't include model the turbine running all the time, then the model would not be conservative. So at least we agreed on one thing.
In paragraph 39C, you testify that you added to the applicant's modeling an emission source to reflect a 9-minute startup because the application states that startups will take that long. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you also testified that you modeled a 30-minute startup because the plan approval allows that length of time for a startup, correct?
Yes.
You don't actually contend that a startup is expected to actually take 30 minutes, correct?
I have to go back to what I've been saying, which is, according to the way this work is done, your modeling mirrors your permit limits. So if the permit limit is 30 minutes, then the modeling should reflect 30 minutes.
Okay,
That's my opinion.
I'm asking a different question.
Okay.
My question is, do you contend that a startup sequence for the turbine that's being proposed here will actually take 30 minutes?
Based on what I've evaluated, it appears that the turbine could operate, the startups could be longer than 9 minutes. Tom Cushing in his rebuttal testimony wrote that 30-minute startups were requested by the applicant so that they could have that amount of time in the event that they would need it. So I base the modeling on that in part. And the rationale for modeling 30-minute startups is in part because of that request, and in part because the permit allows 30 minutes. So, backing up, if before the modeling was submitted, I would have modeled a 30-minute startup. I found impacts, then I would discuss how we could reduce the time frame for startups, model those, and then the permit would mirror whatever startup time period we modeled.
Okay, so you modeled startup sequences at 30 minutes because the permit says that startup sequences shall not exceed 30 minutes, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And beyond the language that says startup sequences shall not exceed 30 minutes, is there anything that you're aware of that leads you to believe that a startup sequence will actually take 30 minutes?
A few failed startups.
And if a failed startup occurs, there's 9 minutes involved, and a second startup sequence would be about 9 minutes, is that correct?
Correct, and if there was a third, another 9, so 27 minutes.
And do
Yeah.
you have some familiarity with the equipment that's being proposed in this case?
I didn't have the opportunity to discuss operations with the equipment vendor or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you know how often, can you offer any opinion about how often the turbine will run through a startup sequence that will last longer than 9 minutes?
Mr. Fickus modeled 2 startups, 18-minute, a duration of 18 minutes, so I have.
I'm asking about your work and expertise,
Okay.
and I'm asking if you have any basis to assume that a startup sequence will last, let's start with, for longer than 9 minutes.
The information, I don't have, the information that I had to base my opinion on is what was available to me. So 416 startups per year, potentially more than 1 startup per day. So startups, again, at the end of the day, the applicant requested 30 minutes for startup. So in order for me to be consistent with evaluating this from a perspective of an air permitting and modeling practitioner, I felt that there was liberty to model a 30-minute startup.
Have you seen something that suggests that the applicant believes that startups will regularly take 30 minutes?
No, I have not.
Okay, and have you seen something outside of what the applicant has said that suggests that startups will regularly last 30 minutes?
I have not.
In paragraph 39D, you say that you modeled 1 startup per day. And you claim that this is conservative because the application states that the compressor station will experience an average of 416 startups per year, correct?
Yes.
And that's not exactly what the application actually says, is it?
I don't have the application in front of me.
You want to have that marked?
I
Just want
think
to reference it because it's in the record.
Yes, please. If you could turn to page 3-8.
I'm there.
And there's a section right above the middle of the page where it says startup and shutdown operations, startup/shutdown operations.
Yes.
You see there, it says the number of startup and shutdown events is conservatively estimated at 416 startup events, 416 shutdown events per year.
Yes.
And then if you also turn to table, I think it's in attachment G, the table B1AF.
Would you repeat that table name, please?
B1AF. And it's called gas-fired turbines emission estimates startup.
Yes, I'm there.
And if you go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows there, see it has a maximum event frequency.
5 rows. Yes.
And that's stated as 416 events per year.
Yes.
Is a maximum event frequency different from an average?
Yes.
And is a conservative estimation different from an average?
I don't know if you can compare the 2 terms. A maximum is more than an average.
Yes. And is a conservative estimation more than an average?
If it's more than what you would expect, it would be conservative.
Is an average a conservative calculation of something, or?
I mean, it depends on the situation. In this situation, I would not call average conservative.
Thank you. more startup events that you have in a year actually means the more periods of no combustion that come along with startup events, correct?
I'm not sure I can say that affirmatively or not affirmatively.
Well,
Having had taken the time to sort of talk that through with an operator.
okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm willing to talk more with you about it, just in order to be helpful, I want to think it through a little bit more.
it's not something that you thought through.
We thought through startups and shutdowns, yes, and in the context of the model.
But not whether the more shutdown events you have in a given year, a necessary consequence of that is having more events during which the turbine is not operating during a year.
It's definitely, the normal operation is punctuated more frequently if you have more startups and shutdowns.
What do you mean by punctuated?
Divided up, so if you run it, if you start it up and run it in normal operation, and you turn it off, and you turn it back on, run it for normal operation, turn it off. If you're doing that
And
more frequently, then I don't know, punctuation is the best word for it.
But you have more periods of downtime, essentially.
You might.
Well, you have to, right? If the machine only has one startup sequence in a year, you have you necessarily have one other point at which the machine is off. If you have 316 startups during a year, you necessarily have 316 periods when the machine is off, correct?
I would have to think about how the demand for pressure would function. You know, the demand for pressure fluctuated a lot, but was fairly consistent. And maybe that would come into play with it as well. So,
But it's not something you've thought carefully about before sitting here today, correct?
the amount of time that the turbine, I'm not sure I can answer your question.
Whether or not you thought about this much before you sat here today?
I've thought about this quite a bit.
About whether or not the
Yeah.
turbine would be off more if it starts up more?
We've contemplated, you know, what could affect the startup and the shutdown. Yes. Again, my focus was to evaluate this as an air quality permitting practitioner would do it.
Understood.
Yeah.
Have you reviewed the manufacturer's guidance on startup emissions?
I have not.
And so you didn't use the numbers that were contained in any manufacturer guidance in your modeling, correct?
I used numbers that were in the permit application.
And do you know how those numbers were derived?
From the application,
Yes, where the numbers in the application came from.
I'm assuming that they came from the manufacturer.
And do you know if they were lifted identically or if there was a measure of conservatism that was included within the numbers that made it to the application?
I don't know.
You mentioned the oxidation catalyst at the beginning of your testimony today.
Yes.
What does that do?
The oxidation catalyst will convert organic compounds to carbon dioxide. So what it does is it's a process called oxidation, where under the right temperature, organic compounds which go into the catalyst will be oxidized. The oxidation process converts, for example, formaldehyde into carbon dioxide.
And I'm oversimplifying,
Sure.
but is it true that in order for the oxidation catalyst to work, it has to heat up?
Yes.
Does your startup modeling assume that throughout the startup sequence there are uncontrolled emissions, that it's not controlled by the oxidation catalyst?
What we used is the emissions in the permit application, which I assume would be uncontrolled,
Okay.
or you know, a very low degree of control.
Can we take a look at the application, page 35, in section 3.1.3.1?
Yes.
And of that page, you see it says table 3-4 provides a summary of emission factors used for each pollutant during the ignition, idle, and loading thermal stabilization phases of the startup event.
Yes,
And it says it is assumed that the oxidation catalyst will not yet have a measurable destruction or removal efficiency during startup, and it is designed to meet control specifications only during normal operation.
yes,
Okay, so with that in mind, is it fair to say that your modeling for the startup sequence assumed that the oxidation catalyst was not controlling emissions during the startup sequence?
yes, that is.
Is it reasonable to assume that the oxidation catalyst will actually provide some degree of control as it heats up during the startup sequence?
I can't comment on that because I haven't reviewed information that would suggest that,
Okay, and
or
that's-
not suggest that.
And it's something that's outside of your knowledge or expertise as you sit here today.
I wouldn't say it's outside of my general knowledge and expertise.
Then could you share the answer with us?
Well, the answer that I would arrive at by reviewing additional information. The information that I had available to me was what was in the permit application.
Okay, so you haven't reviewed information that would allow you to determine whether or not the oxidation catalyst would begin to take effect as it heated up through the process before 9 minutes.
No,
And you don't know in a general sense whether that is something you would expect to occur, correct?
it wouldn't be something that I would assume to occur.
In paragraph 40, you talk about some of the results of your modeling, and you say that you compared the 24-hour and annual formaldehyde model results with their respective TELs and AALs.
Yes,
And to do that, for the 9-minute startup model, you first compared the startup emission source to the TELs and AALs, correct?
yes.
And when I say startup emission source, what does that mean to you?
The startup emission source is the source in the model that represents the emissions that occur during the 9-minute startup.
And it includes both the startup and the normal operation of the turbine.
That's correct.
And for that, you found no exceedances of the AALs and TELs, correct?
I'm sorry, I don't follow. I'm looking at table 1.
Yes, for the, we're looking at the startup only sequence.
Okay.
And in table 1 for the startup only sequence, is it true that you found no exceedance of the AALs and TELs?
Yes.
What you did find is that when you modeled the 9-minute startup sequence, you found that the AAL is exceeded for formaldehyde when startup occurs when the other emission sources are operating, correct?
Yes.
And what are the other emission sources?
Some boilers, emergency generators. There's some other ones. I don't have the list in my head right now to read.
Okay.
But we did, given that we imported the applicant's model, which included all of the emission sources, we assumed that we accounted for the emission inventory that the applicant used.
Okay. And that included fuel gas heater, correct?
Again, if it's in the model, that's correct.
You did know the emergency generator, correct?
Yes,
And there are boilers at the neighboring metering and regulation station, correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And so when you looked at the startup sequence with all of those other things operating as well, then you showed for the 9-minute startup sequence the exceedances that are listed in the second to last column of the chart on page 10, table 1, correct?
Correct.
And the exceedances that we're talking about are for the annual standard, is that correct?
Correct.
The annual standard is 0.08, correct?
Correct.
And you've got 0.09 for 6 a.m., correct?
Yes.
And for 12 noon,
Yes,
And then there are two that actually are the same level as the standard, which you've also said show exceedances, correct?
yes, I think that's probably due to rounding error. We added another decimal digit. The number would be higher than 0.08.
Is it fair to say that in any case, the numbers that you came up with are very close to the AALs or TELs? Rather.
They are within 10%. With 10%.
When you ran the model to get these results, the model actually identified spatially or geographically where the exceedances are expected to occur, correct?
Yes,
And that is not something that you included in your written direct testimony, correct?
correct.
It doesn't say, for example, how many receptor locations predicted an exceedance or where any exceedance were located with respect to the site, correct?
Correct.
You don't know if these are at the fence line or somewhere else, correct?
They were at the fence line and maybe one outside of the fence line for one of the scenarios we modeled.
That's something that you know from looking at your modeling, but you did not include in your report, correct?
That's correct. The intent wasn't to not share that information. I didn't.
Thank you. Can we mark this for identification, please?
Can you identify the document, please?
Yes. This is from the AirMod output file, and it is called the Summary of Maximum Annual Results Averaged Over 1 Year.
Can you tell me who prepared this?
I believe you did.
Okay, I didn't know if it was an output from files I provided or.
That's exactly what it is. We printed it, but it's from your model.
Okay,
This is-
so I haven't had a chance to review the electronic modeling files or just so we all know.
So if you could wait till that gets around, and this is applicant's exhibit number 15, right? 15.
I'm all set.
Okay. So I believe what we're looking at is a printout of your output file for the 6 a.m. maximum annual results averaged over a year.
Yes,
And do you recognize that that's what this document is?
it appears to be that document.
And there is a column on the left-hand side of the page that says group. Do you see that?
Group ID?
Group ID. Okay,
Yes.
Yes. And the emission sources that you modeled are listed here in that SU9 is the startup emission source for a 9-minute sequence, correct?
Yes,
And the 1N SU9 is the startup sequence with all other emitting sources operating at the same time, correct?
yes,
For 9 minutes. And 1N SU30 is a 30-minute startup sequence with all other emitting sources operating at the same time as well, correct?
correct.
What is HI50?
HI50 would be the facility operating at 50% load, I believe.
So the data that's printed out here from your output file lines up with a specific row of your results column that's shown in your testimony in table 1, correct?
I haven't had a chance to compare them. Do you want to point out a number?
Yeah, well, this is the 6 a.m. output file. So if you look at the 6 a.m. Row and the annual averaging period, you showed for the 1N SU9, which is the startup plus all of their sources operating, a predicted value of 0.09, correct?
Yes,
Okay, and that lines up with the second group ID, 1SU9, in the modeling file, and it says highest value is 0.08782.
that's right. So the difference, I think as I mentioned earlier, is just because one number goes to more decimal digits than the other.
Yeah, so in this instance, you rounded up a little bit, in other words.
Yes, I did. And the rounding, my intent in rounding wasn't to present a higher number, it was just to go up that number of decimal digits. That's just the way it wound up.
Now, what are all of the other values that are being shown in the modeling output file, in the average concentration column?
Those other values are the second highest on down to the 10th highest model predicted value.
And so for this time of the day, every single other value is below the AAL and TEL, correct?
Yes,
Which means that there was a single exceedance at a single receptor location model, correct?
correct.
And that single exceedance is located with respect to, or can be located with respect to the actual site with the geographic coordinates that follow the average concentration number that we looked at, correct?
Yes, the two numbers to the right.
And you did not identify that testimony or location, correct?
I did not.
I'm sorry, let me ask it again. You did not identify that location in your testimony, correct?
I did not.
Thank you. Did you look to see where the exceedances that you were opining about were located?
Yes,
None of them are in the location of a residential neighborhood, correct?
that's correct.
None of them were off the peninsula that is the proposed site of the compressor station, correct?
Correct. For this scenario.
You acknowledge that in addition to the modeling method that we've been discussing so far, which I'll call the hour of the day approach,
Yes,
there's another way to do this as well, correct?
there is another way you could do it.
You called it a second possible approach, correct?
I believe that's how I referred to it in my testimony.
That's in paragraph 43 of your testimony.
Let me just verify that. Yes, that's what it says.
And instead of assuming that the turbine would start up at the same time every day, you calculated annualized emissions, correct?
That's right. So the way that modeling approach works is you multiply the pound per hour emission rate that you develop for the startup by the number of hours of startups per year divided by 8760 hours per year. You plug that into the model. You don't use the hour of day approach. You don't turn any emission source. You assume you assume all the emission sources are running. And so what you're modeling is a small fraction of air pollution related to startups being emitted every hour of the year.
And when you ran the annualized approach, you did not assume one startup a day like you did for the hour of day approach, correct?
Correct.
And you used 416 startups per day, correct?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
Why did I do what?
Why did you use 365 startups when you used the hour of day approach, and then 416 startups when you did the annualized approach?
Well, I assumed roughly one startup per day, and I don't know, I think I did what you said I didn't do. Oh, not clear.
Okay. I believe
Yeah.
that when you use the hour of day approach,
Yes.
you use 365 startups per year. You assumed one per day.
Yes, that is right.
And I believe that when you did the annualized approach, you actually assumed 416 startups per year, so more than one per day.
We took the mass of emissions that would occur from 416 startups per year. So that was, earlier I mentioned that there was, when I say the application says there's 735 pounds per year from startups. And I divided that by 365 to approximate one startup per day. That way we're able to account for all the emissions that are released in the course of a year from the startups.
In your calculation in paragraph 43, you specified that you use startup hours of 62.4 hours per year for the 9-minute startup.
Yes, that's right.
And I did the math, multiplied 9 minutes times 416 to get a number of minutes and divided that by 60 to get a number of hours, and I got 62.4 hours per year. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. So you were actually modeling, when you modeled the annualized approach, 416 startup events, correct?
Right.
So why did you model more startup events when you looked at it on an annualized basis than you did when you looked at it?
Well, I actually did for both. So if you look there, I had to model, in my view, I had to take into account all of the emissions that would be released in a year. So I back calculated from the annual emissions that were provided in the application. So that's where I got the 2.01, or it's 2 pounds per hour when you back calculate. So the goal is, we're trying to approximate one startup per day, and we're trying to account for all the emissions that occur in a year. So that was my approach for trying to address both.
So in the annualized approach, did you assume one startup a day, but the emissions associated with 416 startups a year?
Yes, I did.
And those are different numbers of startups, correct?
I assumed that, when you take 416 and you divide it by 365, you come up with a number that's pretty close to 1. So I just assumed, I made the assumption that the amount of emissions, that would represent the one startup per day.
Even though the numbers don't quite line up.
The numbers that the way I did the math allows us to account for all the annual emissions.
But that's not something that you thought that you should be modeling when you modeled the 9-minute startup sequence using the hour-of-day approach?
I thought that all along was that it would be important to include all of the annual emissions in the pound and reflect that within the pound per hour emission rate for how we conceptualize one startup.
But when you modeled the using the hour-day approach, you only assumed 365 starts, correct?
We assumed one startup per day, so that the model is configured to represent one startup per day.
And did you assume emissions associated with 416 startups in that approach as well?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry if that wasn't clear in the testimony. It's in Appendix B, the way I calculated it as well. So,
I understand that. I appreciate the clarification.
yeah, you bet. The results with that approach are still very similar to Mr. Fickus's results that he modeled as well. So they're just, I would say, two different approaches, and I think we both arrived at the same conclusions.
So there is conservatism in both of these models in the, to the extent that the application says that there will be no more than 416 startup events. You're modeling the emissions associated with 416 startup events, correct?
I would say it's conservative, and for the same reason that the applicant said that it was a conservative amount. So 416 was established in the application as a conservative number.
Is it true that when you did the annualized approach for 9-minute startups, or for startups, you only calculated it assuming a 30-minute startup, or did you do both?
I Are you saying, did I look at an annualized, did I run an annualized model for a 9-minute?
Yeah, well, in your report, we looked at table 1.
Yeah.
And that uses the hour-of-day approach to model a 9-minute startup sequence, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then we're talking about the fact that you also did modeling for annualized emissions in paragraph 43 of table 3, correct?
Yes.
But here you did not model a 9-minute startup sequence. You only modeled or only included results of
Yes.
a model for 30 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the reason is because the modeling showed an exceedance for 30-minute startups. It didn't show an exceedance for startups lasting less than that amount of time, and I didn't think it would be meaningful to include that. Perhaps I could have included that information, but the intent was not to only show when violations occur. The intent was to show, in what scenarios exceedances would occur.
And so for the annualized approach, when you modeled a 9-minute startup sequence, you showed or you found no exceedances of the AAL for formaldehyde in any location whatsoever, correct?
That's what I recall.
And
Obviously, I didn't include that in this, but the reason was because I didn't find any exceedance.
which also means that when you modeled the 9-minute startup sequence using an annualized approach, you found no exceedances of the TEL for formaldehyde in any location whatsoever,
That's
correct?
correct.
And the exceedance that you just referred to with respect to the 30-minute annualized model is shown in table 3, correct?
Yes.
And can you show me where the exceedance is? It's for the annual.
Right, so table 3.
Yep.
The exceedance is, there's two shown there. One is for the startup only emission source, SU30, that's 0.19. And the other is, actually I corrected that. That's in my adopted amended testimony. The correct value is 0.16 for startup only, and for startup plus other sources, .16.
And here again, just like with respect to the results set forth in table 1, the model actually predicted specific receptor locations where exceedances were shown, correct?
Yes.
And you have not identified those
I
in
have
your
not.
testimony, correct?
Correct. Sorry, I interrupted. I apologize.
Okay, we're doing pretty good.
Okay.
In paragraph 44 of your testimony, you say that the available information does not support solely using the annualized model, correct?
Correct.
And what that means is, though, that the annualized model does provide you with relevant information, correct?
Yes. It's not the most conservative approach, but it is an approach.
And you acknowledge in paragraph 44 that the annualized approach is used for modeling intermittent operations such as startups, correct?
Yes, so it has been used. I've seen it used, for example, for modeling emergency generators, smaller sources whose startup emissions are much lower than the proposed source, in cases where there's not, for example, an oxidation catalyst, which is assumed not to be working, performing at its design destruction efficiency during startup.
Is it your opinion that the hour of a day approach leads to a more conservative result
Yes.
than the annualized approach?
Yes.
That does not necessarily mean that the hour of a day approach is a more accurate representation of expected emissions, though, correct?
Well, the reason I like the hour-a-day approach, based on what I've evaluated, is that if we're assuming approximately one startup per day, we can count on one startup per day. So move forward with that assumption. And it's a fairly, we don't know necessarily exactly when the startup will occur, but roughly speaking, we're going to get one per day. So if that's the case, then we have to look at how that actual operation scenario, how those emissions would impact the model's prediction of 24-hour and annual concentrations. So that's why I prefer the hour-a-day approach.
You said, roughly speaking, we will get one startup per day, correct? Is that solely based on the notion that the permit says that startups shall not exceed 416 in a year?
Yes, and yes, it's roughly that.
Does any of the 30-minute startup sequence modeling that you perform take into account how often startup events are expected to take 30 minutes?
No. It doesn't for
So-
any of the scenarios that I model. So to be consistent, I had to model that way.
And so when you model 30-minute startup sequences using the fixed hour-a-day approach, you just assumed that all 365 startups that you modeled would last an entire 30 minutes, correct?
Correct.
And same thing, when you use the annualized approach, you just assumed that all, I think 416 startups in that case would last 30 minutes each, correct?
Yes.
Your 30-minute model does not take account for whether or not startups are actually supposed to, or expected to take 30 minutes, correct?
No, the modeling doesn't address the likelihood of the length of a startup. There's no, for example, statistical module within the model that you can parameterize that would calculate a probability of the length, and then that number would then be factored into the calculations.
In your original testimony, you did attempt to use the formaldehyde model to predict benzene emissions, correct?
I attempted to relate the results, yes.
To predict benzene emissions?
Yes.
And you didn't actually go through a process of modeling benzene emissions, correct?
That's correct.
And that's because you thought that you could project benzene emissions associated with the startup from the formaldehyde emissions that you had modeled, correct?
So upon reviewing Mr. Fickus's peer review of my work, it became apparent to me that I couldn't use that approach. Mr. Fickus pointed out that the control efficiency for benzene is different from the control efficiency for formaldehyde. So I decided that that was no longer accurate and not useful to this proceeding. So that's my opinion is, and I didn't have the opportunity to go back and remodel benzene myself. So that was I recant my testimony regarding benzene.
And we'll clarify that in a second. When you modeled formaldehyde, you evaluated both a 9-minute startup sequence and a 30-minute startup sequence, correct?
Yes.
At least for the hour-a-day approach, correct?
Yes.
And you testified earlier that you added to the applicant's modeling an emission source to reflect a 9-minute startup because the application says that startups will take that long, correct?
Yes.
But when you originally did the benzene calculation in your testimony, you only projected benzene for a 30-minute event, correct?
I don't recall off the top of my head.
Can you take a look at your testimony?
What paragraph?
Is this relevant though at this time?
I'm just trying to understand why it is you arrived at your calculations.
Cramb, what paragraph?
Yes. Table 4 and paragraph 45.
I'm there, I'm sorry.
Okay, so is it true that when you performed a calculation to try to project benzene emissions, you only projected benzene for a 30-minute event in your testimony and not a 9-minute?
That's correct.
Why did you leave out the 9-minute calculation for benzene?
Well, I didn't, my intent wasn't to leave out or to exclude or to avoid or anything like that. My intent was to provide information which showed when there would be exceedances.
Okay,
And so there were no, when I did that incorrect estimate, I did not find an exceedance of the benzene AAL or TEL.
and you didn't feel that it was important to tell the parties involved in this proceeding that information in your testimony, correct?
Well, I felt it was important to tell the parties involved that I made a mistake and that I am no longer relying upon the benzene calculations that I did.
Okay, that's a slightly different issue. I'm just asking whether or
Yeah.
not you thought it was important to tell parties involved in this proceeding that when you tried to calculate benzene emissions for 9 minutes, you did not find any exceedances.
I don't know if it's, my intent wasn't to explore whether or not it was important or not important. My intent was to provide model results for when there were exceedances, because I felt like that would be useful information, and if the information for a 9-minute model result, which would show no exceedances, if I didn't include that, then it would logically not be evaluated as part of this proceeding.
Okay.
Yeah.
In any case, you are completely withdrawing your testimony that's set forth in paragraphs 45 and table 4 of your initial pre-filed written testimony, correct?
Let me just double check that. Yes.
In paragraphs 46 through 48 of your testimony, you discuss background levels of toxics.
Yes.
I'm curious if you're aware of any instance in which the Mass DEP has added background air quality concentrations of toxics to model predicted concentration.
I am not aware of them having done that.
Thank you, Mr. Hinkley. I have no further questions.
You're welcome.
Does the department have cross-examination of Mr. Hinkley?
Good morning, Mr. Hinkley. My
Good
name is
morning.
MacDara Fallon.
I'm sorry I didn't catch your name.
First name is MacDara, last name is Fallon. I represent the department.
Good morning.
Thank you for your testimony this morning. The department has reviewed.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt for just one
Yes.
second?
Do you want to take a break?
I just want to ask that, yes, that would be wonderful, but I would like to ask that we admit the exhibit that was marked for identification.
Any objection?
With respect to his output files.
That would be number 15. That's allowed.
Thank you.
Is it appropriate to take a?
Very quick. We have no questions for this witness. It was covered, all our questions were covered by
Okay.
Mr. Crumb's testimony, so thank you for your testimony.
I can keep going. I'm good.
Why don't we take, it's a 4 to 11.
Keep other people down. That's fine by me too.
We're going to take a
As if I
10-minute
had a
break. It's almost 10 to 11, and we'll come back for redirect at 11. Okay? The Associated Citizens Group like redirect with Mr. Hinkley.
Yes, briefly, Ms. Rothschild, and just to start, am I loud enough for everybody today?
Yes, again, if people in the back can't hear, please raise your hand. And I know there are empty seats farther to the front.
I think it's still good morning, Mr. Hinkley.
Good morning.
Just got a couple questions for you. You were cross-examined concerning other projects you've done where you did not do startup modeling. Do you recall that examination?
Yes.
Would you like to make any observations on the number of startups that were projected for those other projects?
For those other projects, there were nowhere near 116 startups per year.
You were also cross-examined concerning the reasons you decided to do your hourly step modeling with AirMod. Do you recall that cross-examination?
Yes.
Could you briefly explain to us the reasons that you decided to use that type of modeling?
I used the hour-a-day modeling approach because I felt that it more closely mimicked the way the facility would actually operate.
And when you say more closely mimicked, what do you mean by that?
That it represented the full quantity of emissions within the hour of startup being emitted.
And how is that different from the annualized model, if at all?
In the annualized model, a fraction of the emissions are modeled, but for every hour of the year.
You were also cross-examined concerning shutdowns, correct?
Yes,
Did you model shutdown emissions as part of your modeling?
I did not.
Would you like to make any observations about what might happen if you did include shutdowns?
It's based on what I reviewed, the shutdown emission rates are higher than for normal operation emission rates. So it could possibly mean that if I had modeled shutdown, the model would have predicted higher concentrations.
And finally, you were cross-examined concerning the randomness or non-randomness of the startups that can be expected at this facility. Do you recall that?
Yes,
What information was available to you, if any, to suggest that these would be random startup events?
I didn't review information which specifically suggested that the startup events would be random. The information that I reviewed in the permit application showed there would be 416 startups per day. I did consult with our project engineer, Bill Powers, to just get a better sense for the appropriateness of assuming one startup per day.
Did you see anything in the plan application to substantiate the suggestion that these would be completely random events?
I didn't see anything that would say that would be completely random.
Nothing further, Mr. John.
Any read?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hinkley.